Welcome to another episode of Let's Talk Product. So tonight, I'm super excited to have Brian Simmons with us. He's a senior product strategist. Welcome to the show, Brian.
Thanks for having
Nice.
me, Brennan. Nice to be here.
Yeah. Yeah. Did you want to do a quick introduction for yourself before we jump in?
Sure. Brian Simmons, I'm a senior PM with Moody's Analytics. Moody's Analytics is the unregulated side of Moody's Corporation. So you might be familiar with the ratings agency. The analytics side is a risk management, data, software, workflow solutions business that sells, risk models and data and financial data, things like that. So I've been with the company about almost 12 years. I've worn a lot of different hats. I started on their client service desk. I moved into a product operations role for a while, and I spent about 5 years in the sales organization. And then for the last 3, I've been leading a rebuild of a V2 for an existing product line on Moody's.com.
That's awesome. Yeah, I checked out your LinkedIn profile, and you have. It's really cool to see someone with that's stuck around at one organization for as long as you have. I've been with my organization for 17 years now, and so I'd be curious later to talk about like the insights and how that's helped you in your career. But before we jump in, I'd love to know, how do you define product management?
Sure. I've been reading a fair amount of Marty Kagan lately, and so I'm sure my answer will be a little bit biased there. But I think of product management as finding ways to solve business problems and delight your users, right? And that can be service opportunities or product enhancements or any number of ways that you might do that. It's kind of
Nice.
as much art as it is science.
No, absolutely. And so for your career, did you stick with the same like end user from like the beginning of your career almost 12 years ago to now? Are you still serving the same customer base?
No,
Yeah.
no, not at all. So one of the things that's interesting about Moody's Analytics is that, the user base can be very broad and very diverse. Maybe a quick rundown that Moody's Analytics has a number of different business units within it. I started in one that was called the Economic and Business Analytics Group at the time. And, our focus was on generating, the product line there was really forecasting macroeconomic data at a US and subnational level, right? National and subnational levels and globally, in fact. And so, I started there. Our customers, our users were a lot of economists, different types of analysts that would be, taking in this data and using it to understand the economic context of the business that they were operating. I did that as, I was a customer service rep there. I was product operations, and I was in sales for that organization. When I switched to kind of a formal PM role, I actually changed business lines. I changed products. I changed users. The only thing that remained the same was who paid my check. And that was, there was a very steep learning curve there. The user today, the typical user is kind of a buy-side fixed income credit analyst. And, I didn't know anything about the capital markets when I started in the role. I didn't know, I didn't know what an API was because I didn't have the functional knowledge of being a PM. So it was definitely a big switch, a big pivot for me coming into this job.
Wow, man, that's awesome. It's really cool. It sounds like it could definitely be a challenge growing and just kind of having such a steep learning curve. But at the same time, for one organization to offer that, I guess, diverse level of experience, it sounds like your career hasn't felt stale. So,
No, almost 12 years at Moody's, I've had really, I consider them 5 very different jobs,
yeah,
So, I'm a millennial and I know millennials can be guilty of bouncing around a lot. And, in fact, I'm a little guilty of bouncing around a lot too. It just I happened to be at a large enterprise where there was a lot of opportunity internally to
yeah,
continue to stretch and grow and learn new skills and deploy the skills I had gained in very different ways. There was a lot about what I learned in my time in sales that I think translated really well to being a product manager. Stakeholder management, communications, communication skills, understanding how to probe at a problem and really be presented with something that is a customer pain point and really pushing on that to understand really what's going on before you start to solution, I think is definitely, training I got in the sales organization, and those skills came with me, right? So I didn't know how to write requirements. I didn't know how to really conduct proper market research in the beginning. But some of the soft skills I think that go along with being a PM definitely came with me.
Nice. So how did you what was that journey like? 5 different jobs. At what point did you realize you wanted to become a product manager? And what was that journey like?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think the fire to get into product was really lit in that product operations role. So I was a desktop publisher was the title. I was really kind of a poor man's graphic designer. I was pulling together the different content pieces into our end product. We had a PDF report, and every month I was pulling those things together. And one of the kind of the side gigs I got to do as a part of having that job was to create an internal, what we call the workflow management system, which is really just an operational efficiency tool, right? Help track different parts of the production process through its life cycle, provide transparency into where it's at, who has the ball at this point in the process. We wanted to understand audit and how long different tasks were taken and those sorts of things. And so I got to play the part of the business liaison or really the product manager, I would come to think of it now, for that project. So it was like me and one developer, and the two of us sat down for like 3 months and built this thing from scratch. And it's still in use today. They have 150 odd users internally in this business unit that use this tool. And it was that experience of like, it's the first time that like ideas that were in my head got visualized in a web application. And I thought, oh man, this is cool, and so that fire got lit there, and then I promptly went into sales for 5 years. Which just goes to show you that the path isn't always linear. There's different spots along the journey that you might pick up different things. So yeah.
Yeah, nice. You know, you mentioned soft skills earlier. I'm a firm believer. From my experience, I also come from a sales, customer facing role. The soft skills have really helped make up for where I've lacked in technical skills and kind of given me an opportunity to use my soft skills to build relationships with like the dev team and ask better questions and that kind of stuff. How do your soft skills come into play for you as a PM? I guess, how do the skills that you learned in your sales role come to play as a PM for you?
Yeah, I mean, soft skills are still skills, right? And they're working with engineers and product owners, and then being able to pivot and go out to the market, and it requires an ability to sort of empathize and communicate and just convey sometimes complex ideas in very simple ways, right? And so I think for me, it's about listening and about figuring out how to tease out a problem. And when I was in sales, right, and we did a fair bit of advisory work, and the thing about advisory work is like you're kind of making it up as you go along, right? And I love that about product management as well, because if you're doing your job right, what you might build might not exist. And so I think you've got to spend a lot of time in the problem, and in order to do that, you got to be able to build trust and empathy and all those kinds of things. When it comes to the product team, I think the way that plays out is kind of I have this sort of fierce intellectual curiosity about me, and I sort of always have. My mom has always talked about it. My dad has always talked about just, being curious about things and asking questions and all the rest. And I can see it in my kids now. I have a 2-year-old and he's the same way, so maybe it's a genetic thing. I don't know. But, but, in elaboration, I'll dig in and try to understand what the engineer is really talking about. And I don't have a technical background. I'm trying to learn a little bit of programming just to be able to speak the language a little bit better. But I think that, that just that willingness goes a long way with the team when, when you're when you're in the suck, right? And you're just in the middle of a really hard problem. I think, having built that camaraderie and that trust earlier in the process comes into play,
Man, I love that you talk about that, because in the trainings I've done, and like the fish, like maybe like the CSPO stuff or some of the Udemy trainings I've done, it never really talked, to be honest, it never really talked about like when you're in the suck, like that, the relationship that you build, being curious, like just if you go in and just from my experience, if you go in and are just curious and ask your dev team just questions, like they're excited to help. Just like you're here to help me learn more about your experience in product and product management. I think good people on good teams want to help each other. And, instead of acting like something or showing no interest in the tech, I mean, if you just ask questions, they get excited, and then you start seeing better solutions, at least from my experience. Then the dev team, if you can get the dev team and the engineers to think outside of the acceptance criteria, it's fun to see what comes to light.
Yeah. I frequently find myself in the middle of an elaboration, just kind of saying like, listen, guys, I don't really know what I'm talking about here, but da 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 da, right? And I think that, and honestly, it's true. There's a lot of times I don't know, but I'm trying to find out, right? And so I sort of state things a lot of times as a question, like I'm going to make a statement, but it's really a question. Can you help me validate my thinking around this? And for me, that's a strategy that really works well. Helps me connect the dots and build that mental model. Because I sort of make an attempt at it, and if I'm wrong or if I'm right, it's sort of reinforced either way.
That's awesome, man. Great points. Then you also have experience in the nonprofit sector with Family Strong Foundation. What have you done with them?
Yeah, I'm not involved there anymore, but I was one of the founding board members. It's it's a kind of a small local family fundraising organization for ALS. Family friend, unfortunately, her father, was diagnosed with and then ultimately died from ALS, and it was very hard on them. And so, and I never knew him prior to his diagnosis, but I did kind of get to see the progression of that. And so, after he passed and after some time went by, they decided, you know what, we don't want to suffer in silence. We want to kind of make the best of this situation. And so, kind of a small group of us, mostly their family, but they were looking for a couple of outside family members to get involved and help provide some kind of a, maybe a challenge to their thinking. They didn't want to be so insular in how they were doing things. And so I was involved there for a couple of years, and then, started having kids of my own, and it just became something that I couldn't dedicate the time that I needed to. And so I had to step down, but they're still raising money. They're doing really well. They have I think they now are up to 2 or 3 kind of main fundraisers each year, a couple $100,000 a year. They're donating to Jefferson University. So it's been fun it was fun to play a very small part in the, the early years of that, and to watch it continue after I've stepped back.
And that's really cool. Yeah. I brought that up because I really think that, nonprofit service or just volunteering your skills, I think that as business leaders or as organizational leaders, we don't always realize, how valuable our skill set is outside of our organization. And you have these incredible nonprofits that sounds like the one you served and the one that I serve, usually just start off as passion projects. and that doesn't always mean that they have the right skill set in place or what's needed to run, because it is a business, right? To run the
Hmm.
business. And I would just I always urge people, business leaders, especially product managers, to get involved with a nonprofit or the cause of their choice, because what might seem just like something simple that we do every day is just groundbreaking, can really change the organization for them.
Yeah, it's funny. I have a former boss that kind of, alluded to the same thing. She said, if we could all, if we as product people or just business leaders in general, if we could take kind of a year sabbatical and go into government work or go into nonprofit or whatever, like the skills we've developed would solve so many issues so quickly. There may be a little bit of arrogance in that I've not, I've never been in those spaces, and so I'm sure they're far more complicated than they seem to be from the outside. But
Yeah.
I think you've got a really valid point there that we do develop skills that can transfer into a lot of different domains. um, the funny thing is, at least, and I suffer from this idea of imposter syndrome. I've been reading so much on LinkedIn early this year of people like, I read this study, from, I think it was from Product Plan, something like 40 to 50% of product managers surveyed feel like, they don't know what they're doing, right? They feel like they're an imposter in the job. And I definitely feel that way, certainly at times, if not regularly. And yet, I can look back 3 years down the line and say, like, you know what, like I actually have learned a ton, and we actually did have a ton of success in shipping product and satisfying customers and growing the business and doing all those kinds of things. So yeah.
Yeah. Nice. So, speaking of just looking back, what advice would you give aspiring product managers?
Well, I would give anyone uh, kind of this little bit of advice. I'll phrase it differently than my dad, but my dad always said, dress for the job you want, not the job you have, right? And sort of operate in a way where you can kind of elevate yourself and surround yourself with people that are smarter than you, more talented, whatever, because some of that will rub off by osmosis. I think if you're trying to advance in your career, the best thing you can do is, make yourself available to take advantage of opportunities to learn things about that job before you have that job, right? And so, I go back to that time in product operations. My day job was simply to pull together content and reports, but I worked extra hours. I made myself available so that I could participate in a project where I could learn kind of what it was like to build a digital product. And indeed, when I interviewed for this role, I harkened back to, there was things that I had, brought with me from sales and, skills like that we talked about already. But I referenced that project quite a few times in different ways, and thinking back on lessons learned and what did we do right or what did we do wrong and what would I want to do differently next time. And so I think that this idea of doing the job you want before you have it um, goes a long way. And that can be internally. I had an opportunity to do some of that kind of work internally as sort of an adjacent part of my job. Side projects, right, can be very valuable as well in the absence of those kinds of opportunities. And I think it's critical to, the project itself almost doesn't matter. It's sort of the discipline of like how you go about the project, right, and how you think about it. And product management is as much a mentality as it is a set of actions. And so, um, you know, just and you don't even necessarily have to build anything. Like you don't know how, you don't have to know how to code. You can just come up with a business model and do the market research and talk to your users and sketch out on a napkin a prototype and do those sorts of things. And then of course there's all kinds of tools coming online now that make it easy. These low code, no code type tools that make it easy to kind of mock something up.
And phenomenal advice. And I think that that's so relevant. I would tell just to piggyback on that, just ship something, just ship a product.
Mm-hmm.
And like you said, today there's low code, no code. There's really no excuse to not ship, because that's what you do as a PM, is to ship. Um, What book
Mhm.
recommendations do
Yeah,
you
I'm
have?
curious. I actually had a question for you.
Yeah, what's up?
I've seen you do a couple of LinkedIn posts recently on this idea of building in public, right?
Yeah,
And I've seen a few people post on this, and I don't know if you're ready to share what you've
yeah,
been working on, but I'm just curious the idea or the process that you're going through to do that kind of stuff.
yeah. So to me, I just started using the term. I don't even, to be honest, know if what it means. If it's just the same as what other people have said, but to me, it's just building in the open and doing things like this podcast and just shipping it right away and posting it in public and like the camera on some of mine the camera suck, the lighting sucks on mine, there's this issues that go on and just I'm not editing, so I've done a couple podcasts in the past, and I think the enemy of shipping is perfection, and my podcast
Oh
would get
yeah.
so held up with just editing and editing and editing. And so what if I say, I still had some great conversation and shared some, and can share value with the community. So that's what I'm doing is I'm just building this, and you're a part of it. Documenting knowledge, really creating, I'm building exactly what I wish I had, right? Because not only are we building a resource of answers to hundreds of different questions and different answers to questions, but it's people, right? I'm doing 20, 15 to 20, 30-minute interviews. And on each of them, it's a different PM leader or product leader at an organization with a different experience that varies a little bit from somebody else, that looks different from somebody else. And my hope is that as people use this resource, they can connect with you, have this great dialogue. Because I didn't start having the dialogue with I mean, the coolest thing about product managers is I love what you said about the imposter syndrome. Is every half of product managers just feel like imposters, and I 100% agree with that. But that also created
Mm-hmm.
an environment where we just want to help each other. And so you're willing to
Mm-hmm.
spend time with me tonight. You're willing to. I see you engaging in the comments on your post. You make yourself accessible, and that's just a transfer of knowledge. So super long-winded answer,
Mm-hmm.
but that's what I'm working on.
No, that's awesome. That's great.
Yeah. Yeah. So book recommendations, I like to ask everyone, what books I would recommend for any PM of any level. What would you recommend?
Sure. So I've just started Inspired by Marty Kagan. It's sitting right here, right in front of me. I haven't gotten too deep into it. I know it's like 12 years old and it's like the Bible, but I just haven't read it yet. Two kids and different priorities. But yeah, there's definitely some things I would recommend. I loved Range by I think it's David Epstein. It was awesome. This idea of, you know, of early specialization being sort of the only key to mastery. And actually, he talks in that book, counter thesis on how, really early specialization is actually the exception rather than the rule, right? So you get these great anecdotes throughout about Tiger Woods versus Roger Federer and all these other things. So that's definitely one I would recommend. Um, I loved Extreme Ownership by Jocko Willink and Leif Bevan. That was great. This idea of leadership lessons from the SEALs. Like, I think my job's high pressure, and then I'd read some of this stuff, and I'm like, oh man, you got a cake job, Brian. So that one was really, really great. I loved. I read Super Forecasting recently. It was sort of mandatory reading for the business unit that I started in at Moody's, but there's definitely a lot of, I think, really good lessons in there about um, this idea of forecasting and answering hard questions, and how, when presented with a hard question, we tend to substitute a similar easy question, but those aren't the same things, and so you answer an easy question, it's not the answer to the hard question, and I think that has a lot of relevance for PMs. um, I read, there's a couple of daily newsletters I get. Stratechery from Ben Thompson. I started on that recently. I think that, in my world, it talks a lot about Amazon, Google, Twitter, Facebook, those kind of big tech type firms. But I think there's a lot of really interesting lessons from them in digital technology products generally that you can abstract and apply to your own world. So I like that one. And then there's a podcast that I got into, and I just went deep on it. The podcast is called Product Talk, by a group called Products Account, and it's just, I don't know, it's fascinating. They've been doing it probably like 3 years now, so they've got a pretty decent backlog of interviews. Again, product leaders from around the spectrum. One of their recent ones was the head of digital for this Broadway company, right? And so they pull in kind of technology leaders from all these different domains, and and so again, there's sort of lessons that you can pull out from that and apply to your own business. So those are some of the resources that I kind of keep track of, and like you, I've been sort of tagging the PM world on LinkedIn, trying to find some additional ones out. There's one on systems thinking that I'm trying to track down, and yeah, so
Nice.
hopefully that helps.
That's a phenomenal list. For Jocko's book, have you listened to Jocko podcast?
I haven't. But I've seen sort of snippets here and there on YouTube, but I haven't really gotten into the podcast itself. Yeah. Actually, most of my exposure to Jocko was through Joe Rogan's podcast, which I love Joe Rogan's podcast. Those are nice. Those are great to listen to.
Yeah, I lived down in San Diego for a few years, and was lucky enough to meet him in person for his release of Discipline Equals Freedom, the Field Manual. So I think that's what it is. Yeah, I think that's what it is. But man, his podcast is phenomenal. If you're on the YouTube, check out, what is it? Stand By to Get Some. There's a really cool little video edited that's like a paragraph from Extreme Ownership that just talks about Stand By to Get Some.
Okay.
So when you think about that's a really good, like, a level set. It's like, okay, how much trouble am I really in? What's my challenges today right now? Because that's what that guy went through.
Yeah.
So, but I'm super excited.
Right.
All those books sound amazing. I have them all written down. So thank you so much for sharing. Thank you so much for joining. How can people get in touch with you?
LinkedIn is probably the best way. Brian Simmons. There's probably a million of us, but I'm the one at Moody's. I think there's only one of me there. So that's probably the best way to get in touch.
Nice. I will link your profile in the comments. So thank you so much for joining me tonight. I really appreciate your time.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you, Brendan. Thank you for having me.